Frank Miller's scarred hands bled as he cut through the rusted barbed wire, imprisoning the massive white horse, never suspecting that freeing this magnificent animal would expose a decades-old conspiracy and change his broken life forever. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning sun cast long shadows across Frank Miller's weathered property, the golden light illuminating every imperfection of his humble Montana ranch. At 67, Frank's body carried the weight of his years of service, both to his country and to the harsh land he now called home. His calloused hands, marked with age spots and scars from decades of labor, gripped his coffee mug as he gazed across his modest spread. 20 acres of mostly barren land, a small cabin that needed more repairs than he could afford, and memories that kept him awake most nights. This wasn't the retirement he had imagined during those long nights in Vietnam, but it was his life now. Frank had been a decorated Marine, serving 2 tours that left him with a Purple Heart, a persistent limp, and nightmares that still jolted him awake in cold sweats 50 years later. The country had moved on, but some part of Frank remained in those jungle clearings, ears always alert to sounds that didn't belong. Another day, he mumbled to himself, setting down the chipped mug on his porch railing. His monthly disability check barely covered the essentials, and the small pension didn't stretch as far as it once had. The neighboring ranches had been bought up by wealthy out-of-staters who saw Montana as their playground, driving up property taxes and making it increasingly difficult for folks like Frank to hold on to their land. As he did every morning, Frank decided to walk his property line. The routine brought him comfort, a way to start each day with purpose. He grabbed his old rifle, not because he expected trouble, but because old habits die hard. The weight of it against his shoulder was familiar, comforting in its own way. The morning was quiet, punctuated only by the songs of meadowlarks and the occasional distant call of an eagle. Frank moved slowly, his damaged knee protesting with each uneven step across the rocky terrain. He was halfway along his eastern border when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a distressed whinny, followed by the unmistakable sound of thrashing. Frank quickened his pace as much as his aching body would allow, following the sounds until he crested a small rise. What he saw below made his heart hammer against his ribs. In the small valley where his property met the public land was a magnificent white horse, the largest he'd ever seen, thrashing desperately against a barbed wire fence. The powerful animal was entangled in the rusted wire, which cut into its front leg and neck with each panicked movement. Behind the trapped horse, 2 smaller white horses, Colts by the look of them, paced nervously, occasionally approaching before darting away in fear. "Easy now," Frank called out, though he knew his voice wouldn't calm the panicked animal. He carefully made his way down the slope, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The massive white horse, easily 17 hands high, rolled its eyes wildly as Frank approached, pulling harder against the wire that only dug deeper into its flesh. Frank had never owned horses himself, couldn't afford to feed them, but he'd worked with them enough in his younger days to recognize a dire situation. This beautiful animal would either tear itself to pieces or collapse from exhaustion if not freed soon. Blood already stained its pristine white coat where the barbed wire had torn into flesh. "I need to get my tools," Frank murmured, backing away slowly. The 2 Colts watched him intently, their ears pricked forward as if they understood his words. They were nearly identical. Pure white like their mother or father, Frank couldn't be sure which the injured horse was, with intelligent eyes that seemed to assess his every move. Frank hurried back to his cabin as quickly as his battered knee would allow. He grabbed his bolt cutters, a blanket, some rope, and the first aid kit he kept stocked for his own injuries. By the time he returned, the great horse had stopped thrashing, instead standing with its head hanging low, sides heaving with exhaustion. The barbed wire had cut deeper and fresh blood trickled down its leg. The Colts had moved closer to their trapped parent, 1 on each side, as if offering moral support. They scattered as Frank approached, but didn't go far, watching with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. "Easy, big fella," Frank said softly, approaching from the side. The horse's ears flicked toward him, but it didn't have the energy to fight anymore. "I'm going to help you. Just stay still for me." For years of combat had taught Frank to keep his hands steady even when his heart raced. He carefully placed the blanket over the horse's back, letting it get used to his scent and presence. The animal trembled beneath his touch, but didn't pull away. "That's it," Frank encouraged, moving slowly to examine the entanglement. The barbed wire had wrapped around the front leg multiple times and had caught in the horse's flowing mane, pulling tight against its neck. One wrong move, and the wire could slice into the jugular. Frank had seen enough death in his lifetime. He wasn't about to let this magnificent creature die if he could help it. With practiced precision, Frank positioned the bolt cutters on the wire furthest from the horse's body. The metal was old and rusted, remnants of a fence line that should have been removed years ago. He squeezed the handles, and with a satisfying snap, the first piece gave way. The horse flinched but remained still, as if understanding that Frank was trying to help. One by one, Frank cut away the sections of wire, carefully unwinding them from the horse's leg and neck. Blood coated his hands, a mixture of the horse's and his own, as the barbs occasionally caught his skin. He barely noticed the pain, focused entirely on freeing the animal. "Almost there," Frank whispered, as he removed the last section of wire from around the horse's neck. The animal let out a deep breath, as if sighing with relief. The wounds were nasty, deep lacerations that would need proper care, but none appeared to have hit anything vital. Frank stepped back slowly, giving the horse space. To his surprise, it didn't immediately bolt. Instead, it turned its massive head toward him, dark eyes studying him with what Frank could only describe as gratitude. Then it took a tentative step toward him, testing its injured leg. The two colts approached cautiously, coming to stand on either side of the larger horse. They were younger than Frank had initially thought, perhaps only a year old. The family resemblance was striking. All three shared the same pure white coat and proud bearing. Frank had never seen horses quite like them, especially not roaming wild in this part of Montana. "You're free now," Frank said, gathering the dangerous barbed wire to dispose of properly. "Best get yourselves home, wherever that is." But the horses didn't leave. The large one, which Frank now believed was the mother, took another step toward him, then lowered her head slightly, as if in a bow. The gesture was so human-like that it sent a shiver down Frank's spine. The colts mimicked their mother, both dipping their heads in unison. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank muttered, unable to shake the feeling that these weren't ordinary wild horses. There was something in their eyes, something that spoke of intelligence beyond what he'd seen in animals before. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Frank knew he should head back. He had chores waiting, and his knee was screaming in protest after kneeling for so long. Yet he couldn't bring himself to leave these creatures, especially with the mother's wounds needing attention. "Come on then," he said, gesturing toward his cabin. "Let's see if we can clean you up a bit more." To his astonishment, the mother horse began to follow him, limping slightly but walking with determination. The colts fell in line behind her, creating a procession that Frank would never have believed if he wasn't witnessing it himself. As they crested the rise and his small cabin came into view, Frank couldn't help but wonder what he had gotten himself into. He lived alone for a reason. Human connections had proven too difficult after the war. Yet here he was, leading 3 wild horses to his home as if they were old friends coming for dinner. What Frank didn't realize was that this unusual encounter would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. Frank's small cabin had never felt so crowded. He stood on his weathered porch, watching with disbelief as the 3 white horses gathered in his front yard. The mother horse's wounds needed attention, but Frank hesitated, suddenly aware of the absurdity of the situation. He was no veterinarian, just an old soldier with a basic first aid kit meant for human injuries. "I don't know what you expect me to do," he said aloud, addressing the mother horse, who watched him with those intelligent eyes, "but I'll do what I can." Frank went inside and returned with a basin of clean water, some antiseptic, and clean cloths. He'd treated enough wounds in his life, both his own and those of his fellow Marines, to know the basics: clean the wound, prevent infection, promote healing. Whether on a human or a horse, the principles remained the same. "This might sting," he warned as he approached the mother horse with a damp cloth. To his surprise, she didn't move away. Instead, she stood perfectly still, watching him work as he gently cleaned the dried blood from her leg and neck. The wounds were deep but clean, the barbed wire having made precise cuts rather than jagged tears. The Colts observed from a few yards away, eerily still and attentive. Frank couldn't shake the feeling that they were studying him, learning from his every move. It wasn't normal horse behavior, at least not from the horses he'd known in his younger days. As Frank worked, he found himself talking to the horses, filling the silence with words he rarely spoke aloud. "Came here after my second tour," he explained, carefully applying antiseptic to the mother's wounds. "Couldn't handle being around too many people anymore. The noise, the expectations, it was all too much. Out here, nobody expects anything from me." The mother horse blinked slowly as if processing his words. One of the Colts took a few steps closer, head tilted slightly. "My wife left during the first tour. Can't blame her. The man who came back wasn't the one she married." Frank's hands moved methodically, wrapping a clean bandage around the worst of the cuts on the horse's leg. "My son visits once a year or so, lives in Seattle with his family. Good kid, but we don't have much to say to each other anymore." The second Colt approached now, both of them flanking their mother, watching Frank's hands as he worked. Their focus was unnerving but oddly comforting. It had been a long time since anyone had listened to Frank so intently. "There," he said, stepping back to examine his handiwork. "Not pretty, but it should keep infection away. You should rest that leg for a while." As if understanding his instructions, the mother horse gingerly tested her bandaged leg, putting minimal weight on it. She then lowered her massive head and nudged Frank's shoulder gently, a gesture of gratitude that brought an unexpected lump to his throat. "You're welcome," he said gruffly, patting her neck. "You all must be thirsty. Let me find something for you to drink from." Frank rummaged through his shed and found an old livestock trough he'd never had use for. It had come with the property and had been gathering dust ever since. He dragged it out, his knee protesting the effort, and positioned it near the outdoor spigot. As he filled it with water, the horses watched patiently, making no move to rush toward the water despite what must have been intense thirst. Only when Frank stepped back did they approach, the mother drinking first, followed by the Colts. Their movements were synchronized, almost choreographed, lacking the pushing and jostling Frank would have expected. "You're not ordinary horses, are you?" Frank mused aloud, leaning against a fence post as he observed them. "Where did you come from? I haven't heard of any white horses around these parts." The nearest neighbor with horses was the Winchester Ranch, about 5 miles east, but Earl Winchester raised quarter horses for barrel racing. Compact, muscular animals, nothing like these elegant creatures. And the nearest wild horse territory was over 100 miles away. As the day wore on, Frank found himself caught in a strange limbo. Common sense told him to contact the authorities. Horses this distinctive must belong to someone, and if they were truly wild, they should be properly relocated. But something held him back. There was a connection forming, something he couldn't explain and wasn't ready to sever. "You can stay the night," he told them as evening approached. "In the morning, I'll make some calls, see if anyone's missing you." Frank returned to his cabin, leaving the horses to graze on what little grass his property offered. Through the window, He watched them as he prepared his simple dinner, beans and cornbread, the same meal he ate most nights. The horses stayed close to the cabin, the mother resting her injured leg while the colts grazed nearby, never straying far. As darkness fell, Frank expected them to wander off, or at least move to the shelter of the trees at the edge of his property. Instead, they settled in the yard, the colts lying on either side of their mother, their white coats almost luminous in the moonlight. Frank slept poorly that night, as he did most nights. The nightmares came as they always did. Vivid flashes of jungle firefights, the faces of men he'd failed to save, the deafening sound of helicopter rotors mixing with gunfire. He woke gasping for air around 2 a.m., his heart pounding and sweat soaking his sheets, despite the cool Montana night. Normally, he would sit on his porch until the panic subsided, sometimes until dawn broke over the eastern hills. Tonight, he did the same, stepping outside with a glass of water and his old wool blanket wrapped around his shoulders. What he didn't expect was the greeting that awaited him. The mother horse was standing at the bottom of his porch steps, her white coat silvery in the moonlight. She nickered softly when she saw him, a sound that seemed almost like a question. The colts remained where they had been lying, their heads raised attentively. "Just the usual," Frank told her, settling into his rocking chair. "War doesn't let you go, even 50 years later." The horse approached the porch and extended her neck, her muzzle gently touching Frank's outstretched hand. The contact was warm, comforting in a way Frank hadn't experienced in years. He found himself stroking her face, running his fingers through her silky mane. "You understand somehow, don't you?" he whispered. The horse remained beside the porch until Frank's breathing slowed and the tremor in his hands subsided. Only then did she return to her colts, settling between them with a soft snort. Frank stayed on the porch until dawn, but for the first time in years, the rest of the night passed without the oppressive weight of loneliness he'd grown so accustomed to. When the sun finally crested the hills, casting long shadows across his property, Frank made a decision. He wouldn't make those calls, at least not today. For now, these mysterious horses would stay. The next morning, Frank awoke to an unfamiliar sound, movement outside his cabin that wasn't the usual forest creatures or wind through the pines. For a moment, disoriented from sleep, his combat instincts kicked in. His hand reached for the rifle he kept beside his bed before reality settled back in. The horses. They were still there. Frank dressed quickly and stepped onto his porch, coffee in hand. The sight that greeted him stopped him mid-sip. The colts were running in wide, joyful circles around his property, their white coats gleaming in the morning sun. But it was what they carried in their mouths that made Frank rub his eyes in disbelief. Tools. His tools. The larger of the two colts had Frank's hammer gently clenched between its teeth. The other carried a coil of rope. They were bringing these items to the mother horse, who stood near the fence line that Frank had been meaning to repair for months. The broken section had been on his to-do list since spring, but his knee had made climbing the ladder necessary for the repair nearly impossible. "What in God's name?" Frank muttered, watching as the colts deposited the tools at their mother's feet. The mother horse turned toward the cabin, eyes locking with Frank's, and nickered softly as if calling him over. Frank approached slowly, still processing what he was seeing. "You want me to fix the fence, is that it?" The mother horse nudged the hammer toward him with her muzzle, then looked pointedly at the broken fence section. The intelligence behind that gaze was unmistakable, and Frank felt a chill run down his spine, not of fear, but of wonder. "All right then," he agreed, picking up the hammer. "I've been putting this off long enough." Working alongside the horses created a rhythm Frank hadn't experienced in years. When he needed a tool, one of the colts would retrieve it from his shed, somehow selecting the correct item each time. When the ladder wobbled under his weight, the mother horse positioned herself beside it, providing stability. The pain in his knee seemed less severe today, the usual stiffness eased by movement and purpose. By midday, the fence was repaired, looking better than it had in years. Frank sat on his porch steps, sweat cooling on his brow, and watched as the Colts inspected his handiwork, with what could only be described as approval. The mother horse stood beside him, her bandaged leg bearing only minimal weight. "I should give you names," Frank said, realizing he couldn't keep thinking of them as the mother and the Colts. "The big one, that's you," he said, looking up at the mare standing beside him. "How about Liberty? Seems fitting." The horse, Liberty now, dipped her head as if in agreement. Frank turned his attention to the Colts. "And you two, Honor and Valor, what do you think?" The Colts pricked their ears forward at the sound of their new names, and Frank could have sworn they exchanged a glance of satisfaction. Liberty nudged Frank's shoulder gently, her soft muzzle leaving a damp spot on his worn shirt. "Glad that's settled," Frank said, rising stiffly to his feet. "Now you three have worked up my appetite. Let me fix some lunch." Inside his cabin, Frank prepared his usual sparse meal, a sandwich and some carrot sticks. On impulse, he grabbed a few extra carrots and an apple he'd been saving, carrying them outside to his new companions. Liberty and her Colts accepted the offerings with gentle lips, their eyes never leaving Frank's face as they ate. After lunch, Frank settled back into his rocking chair with a book, one of the few pleasures he still allowed himself. To his surprise, Liberty positioned herself nearby in the shade of the porch overhang, while Honor and Valor continued to explore the property, always staying within sight. "You know," Frank said to Liberty, "I should be making calls, finding out where you belong. Horses like you must be worth something to somebody." Liberty's ears flicked backward slightly, her dark eyes studying him with what looked remarkably like concern. "Don't worry," Frank reassured her. "I'm not calling anyone today. Maybe not tomorrow either." The peaceful afternoon was interrupted by the distant sound of an approaching vehicle. Frank recognized the rumble of Earl Winchester's old truck before it came into view. Earl, his nearest neighbor at 5 miles away, visited occasionally to check on Frank, though they weren't close friends. "Company?" Frank told Liberty, who had already turned her head toward the sound. "Better not do anything too smart while Earl's here. He's already suspicious enough about the crazy old vet living out here alone." Earl's truck pulled up in a cloud of dust, and the middle-aged rancher stepped out, his eyebrows shooting up at the sight of the 3 white horses in Frank's yard. "Frank Miller," Earl called out, approaching cautiously. "Since when do you keep horses? And what kind are these? Never seen anything like 'em." Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Found them yesterday. Mother was caught in some old barbed wire on my east property line. Fixed her up and they've stuck around." Earl circled Liberty at a respectful distance, his experienced eye taking in her proportions, the quality of her coat, and the bandages on her leg and neck. "These aren't just any horses, Frank. They look like Lepitziners, or maybe Andalusians, expensive animals. Pure white like this? They must belong to someone with deep pockets." Frank had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his heart sink a little. "Haven't heard of anyone missing horses around here." "Neither have I," Earl admitted, "but I can ask around. The Reynolds up north were talking about starting some fancy breeding program. Might be theirs." Liberty had gone still during this conversation, her attention fixed on Earl with an intensity that made the rancher step back slightly. "That horse watching me like she understands what we're saying," Earl said with a nervous laugh. "Gives me the creeps a little." "She's just curious," Frank said defensively. "They all are. Smart animals." Earl nodded, unconvinced. "Well, I just stopped by to see if you needed anything from town. Heading in for supplies tomorrow." "I'm fine, thanks," Frank replied, his usual response. He never asked for help, even when he needed it. Earl lingered, still watching the horses. "Frank, if nobody claims them, you should consider selling them. Horses like these could fetch enough to fix up your place proper, maybe even set you up comfortable for a few years." The thought had crossed Frank's mind, but hearing Earl say it aloud felt wrong somehow. He looked at Liberty, whose gaze hadn't wavered, and then at Honor and Valor, who had moved closer to their mother, as if sensing a threat. "We'll see," Frank said non-committally, still hoping to find their rightful owner. After Earl left, promising to return with any news, Frank sat in silence for a long while. The idea of parting with these animals after just one day felt strangely painful, as if they'd already become woven into the fabric of his solitary life. "Don't worry," he finally told Liberty, reaching out to stroke her strong neck. "I'm not selling anybody." Liberty lowered her head until her forehead rested against Frank's chest, a gesture so deliberate, so full of what seemed like gratitude, that Frank had to swallow hard against the emotion rising in his throat. As evening approached, Frank realized he had accomplished more today than in the previous month combined. The fence was fixed. He'd cleaned out the rain gutters, with Honor somehow knowing to bring him the gutter scoop, and even managed to repair the loose step on his porch, with Valor retrieving the exact size of nail needed. For the first time in years, Frank felt useful, needed, and strangely content. That night, Frank slept more soundly than he had in years. The nightmares that had plagued him since Vietnam made only a brief appearance before dissolving into peaceful darkness. When he woke, the sun was already high in the sky. He had overslept by hours, something that hadn't happened since his military days, when exhaustion would occasionally overcome even his trauma-induced vigilance. Stepping onto his porch with coffee in hand, Frank was greeted by an astonishing sight. Honor and Valor were methodically pulling weeds from his long, neglected vegetable garden, carefully distinguishing between the withered tomato plants and the invasive growth around them. Liberty supervised from nearby, occasionally using her muzzle to guide one of the Colts when they hesitated over a particular plant. "I'll be damned," Frank whispered, watching as Honor delicately extracted a dandelion without disturbing the struggling pepper plant beside it. These weren't just intelligent animals, they were something else entirely. Frank had heard stories of working horses, dogs that could perform complex tasks, even dolphins that seemed to understand human instructions with uncanny precision. But this was different. These horses were problem-solving, making decisions, working together with purpose that went beyond trained behavior. After finishing his coffee, Frank joined them in the garden. His knees protested as he knelt in the dirt, but he found the pain more bearable with the horses working alongside him. By midday, the garden looked better than it had in years, with neat rows visible again and the surviving plants freed from choking weeds. "Think anything will actually grow?" Frank asked Liberty as he stood back to survey their work. The mare nickered softly, nudging him toward the shed where his watering can was stored. "Right. Water. Can't expect miracles without the basics." As Frank filled the watering can at the outdoor spigot, a thought struck him. These horses needed proper food. The sparse grass on his property wouldn't sustain them for long, especially Liberty, who was still recovering from her injuries. His modest savings wouldn't stretch to quality hay and grain, but he couldn't bear the thought of them going hungry. "I'll figure something out," he promised as he watered the newly cleared garden. "Maybe Earl knows someone selling hay cheap." As if in response to his concerns, Honor trotted to the edge of the property and returned dragging a fallen branch in his mouth. The young colt dropped it at Frank's feet, then looked expectantly at the axe leaning against the woodshed. "Firewood?" Frank questioned, glancing at the substantial pile he'd already chopped for the coming winter. "I've got plenty." Honor pawed at the ground, then looked toward town. Valor joined his brother, both colts staring in the direction of the weekly farmers' market where locals gathered to sell and trade goods. "You want me to sell firewood at the market?" Frank asked incredulously. When both colts bobbed their heads in what looked remarkably like a nod, he couldn't help but laugh, a rusty sound he barely recognized as his own. "Well, I suppose I could use the extra cash for your feed." The idea wasn't bad. Frank had access to plenty of deadfall on his property, and splitting wood was one chore his damaged body could still manage reasonably well. The farmer's market wasn't far. He could load his old truck and be there by morning. For the rest of the day, Frank worked alongside the horses, gathering fallen branches and splitting them into marketable firewood. Honor and Valor proved remarkably adept at dragging even large branches from the woods, while Liberty seemed to have an eye for quality, nudging aside pieces that were too rotten or wet to burn well. By sunset, Frank's truck bed was full of neatly stacked split firewood. His back ached, and his hands were raw, but there was satisfaction in the work that he hadn't felt in years. As darkness fell, he sat on his porch with a bowl of stew, watching as the horses grazed nearby. "I should build you a shelter," he mused aloud. "Can't have you out in the open when winter comes." Liberty raised her head at his words, eyes reflecting the porch light. For a moment, Frank could have sworn he saw something like hope in that gaze. Not just animal contentment, but a deeper emotion, a connection that transcended the barrier between species. That night, Frank dreamed not of jungle warfare, but of open fields and running horses. He woke at dawn feeling strangely optimistic, a sensation so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. After a quick breakfast, he loaded a few more pieces of wood onto his truck and headed to the farmer's market. The Clearwater Valley Farmers Market wasn't large, just a gathering of local ranchers, farmers, and craftspeople selling their goods in the community center parking lot every Saturday. Frank hadn't attended in years, preferring his isolation to the social requirements of commerce. But today, with his truck full of firewood and a purpose driving him, the prospect seemed less daunting. He found a spot at the edge of the lot and arranged his wood in neat stacks on a tarp behind his truck. People were already milling about, examining produce and handmade goods from other vendors. Frank sat in his folding chair, cap pulled low, wondering if anyone would even approach him. "Frank Miller, as I live and breathe," came a familiar voice. Margaret Chen, the widow who ran the local general store, stood before him with a basket of fresh bread balanced on her hip. "Haven't seen you here in, 5 years?" "About that," Frank agreed, uncomfortable with the attention but managing a small nod of greeting. "Nice-looking firewood," Margaret commented, examining his stacks. "All hardwood?" "Mostly oak and maple," Frank confirmed. $10 a bundle. I'll take 2, Margaret said promptly, handing him a $20 bill. "And I'll tell the Hendersons. Their oldest girl just moved into that cabin by the lake. She'll need wood for the winter." By noon, Frank had sold more than half his stock. The cash in his pocket wasn't much, but it would buy feed for the horses for at least a couple of weeks. More importantly, he'd reconnected with people he'd almost forgotten. Neighbors who asked after his health, old acquaintances who shared news of the community, even a few fellow veterans who understood the shadows behind his eyes without needing explanation. As Frank was packing up his remaining wood, a tall man in an expensive-looking coat approached, examining the firewood with interest. "Good quality," the man commented. "You cut this yourself?" "Yes, sir," Frank replied, noting the man's clean hands and city posture. "Not a local." "I'm Daniel Reynolds," the man said, extending his hand. "Just bought the old Mackenzie estate north of here, converting it to a horse breeding facility." Frank's heart skipped a beat. Reynolds, the name Earl had mentioned. "Nice to meet you," he managed, shaking the offered hand. "I heard an interesting story from Earl Winchester," Reynolds continued, his keen eyes studying Frank. "Something about 3 white horses showing up on your property? Pure white, exceptional conformation." Frank hesitated, torn between honesty and the sudden fierce desire to protect liberty, honor, and valor. News travels fast around here. Small communities always do. Reynolds smiled, but his eyes remained calculating. I'd be interested in seeing these horses. In fact, I'm missing 3 animals that match that description, a Lipizzaner mare and her 2 yearling colts. Valuable animals. Very valuable. Frank's stomach tightened. What makes you think they're yours? Pure white Lipizzaners are rare in this region, Reynolds said smoothly. And I've had 3 disappear from my property about a week ago. Unusual coincidence, wouldn't you say? Frank couldn't argue with the logic, but something felt wrong. The way Reynolds referred to the horses as animals and property grated against Frank's instincts. Tell you what, Reynolds said, pulling out a business card. I'll stop by your place tomorrow to have a look. If they're mine, I'll make it worth your while. Say, $5,000 as a finder's fee. $5,000. The amount would change Frank's life. Repair his roof, fix his truck properly, maybe even install better heating before winter. But as he took the card, all he could think about was Liberty's intelligent eyes and the way honor and valor worked so diligently alongside him. I'll be there around noon, Reynolds said, apparently taking Frank's silence for agreement. Looking forward to it. The drive home from the farmer's market seemed longer than usual, each mile giving Frank's thoughts more time to tangle. Reynolds' business card sat heavy in his shirt pocket, a constant reminder of the choice that lay ahead. $5,000, a fortune to a man in Frank's position. Yet as his old truck rattled over the familiar dirt road leading to his cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about Reynolds didn't sit right. When Frank's property came into view, the 3 white horses were waiting at the fence line as if they'd been watching for his return. They moved in perfect unison, following his truck up the drive and gathering around as he stepped out. Made some money today, Frank told them, patting Liberty's neck. Enough to get you proper feed for a while. But the weight of Reynolds' impending visit cast a shadow over even this small victory. Frank unloaded the remaining firewood, his movements mechanical as his mind churned through his limited options. If the horses truly belonged to Reynolds, Frank had no legal right to keep them. But the connection he felt with these animals went beyond ownership. In just 2 days, they had become something like family. The first he'd allowed himself in decades. As evening approached, Frank sat on his porch steps watching as honor and valor playfully chased each other across the yard. Liberty stood nearby, her watchful eyes never straying far from her colts or from Frank. The wounds on her leg and neck were already healing remarkably well, far faster than Frank would have expected. He's coming tomorrow, Frank said aloud, knowing somehow that Liberty understood. Says you're his. Lipizzaners, he called you. Valuable horses. Liberty approached slowly, her movements deliberate and graceful despite her injuries. She lowered her massive head until her eyes were level with Frank's, their gaze so intense that Frank felt as if she were looking straight into his soul. Did you run away from him? Frank asked quietly. Is that why you were caught in that fence, trying to get away? Liberty's ears flicked backward, a gesture Frank had come to recognize as distress. She turned her head toward the north, in the direction of Reynolds' property, and let out a soft nickering sound that seemed filled with anxiety. Honor and Valor stopped their play immediately, trotting over to stand beside their mother. The 3 horses formed a tight group, their body language communicating a fear that Frank could almost physically feel. I won't let him take you if you don't want to go, Frank found himself promising, though he had no idea how he could stop a wealthy man with the law on his side. We'll figure something out. That night, Frank pulled out his old army footlocker from under his bed, something he hadn't opened in years. Inside, beneath faded photographs and his service medals, lay his discharge papers and a small leather pouch. The pouch contained his emergency fund, $3,000 in cash that he'd been saving for a crisis. Combined with what he'd earned at the market, It wasn't close to what the horses might be worth, but it was all he had. "Maybe I can buy them from him," Frank muttered to himself, knowing even as he said it how unlikely that was. Men like Reynolds didn't need money from men like Frank. Sleep eluded him that night. Frank tossed in his bed, his mind replaying scenarios of Reynolds arriving, claiming the horses, loading them into a trailer while they resisted. Would Liberty fight? Would the Colts try to run? The thought of them being forced away twisted Frank's gut with an anxiety he hadn't felt since the war. When dawn finally broke, Frank was already up making coffee and watching the horses through his kitchen window. They were huddled together near the edge of his property, heads close as if in conference. Their behavior seemed almost human, purposeful, planned, communicative in a way that went far beyond normal animal interaction. After breakfast, Frank went out to meet them, carrying 3 apples he'd been saving for a special occasion. As he approached, the horses broke their huddle and came to greet him, their movements synchronized as always. "Got a plan?" Frank asked wryly, offering the apples on his open palm. "Because I'm fresh out of ideas." Honor took his apple and then did something that stopped Frank's breath. The colt walked to the center of the yard and, using his hoof, began to scrape at the dirt. Frank watched, transfixed, as Honor methodically drew lines in the soil, creating what looked unmistakably like a crude map. Valor joined his brother, adding his own marks to the drawing. When they finished, both colts looked expectantly at Frank, then at the marks on the ground. Frank approached slowly, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. There was a square that must represent his cabin, a line showing the road, and then a series of marks leading into the mountains to the west, away from Reynolds' property to the north. "You want to leave? Hide in the mountains?" Frank asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Liberty approached, her eyes solemn, and stood beside the crude map. She lowered her head toward the mountain region and then raised it to look directly at Frank. "You want me to come with you?" he realized, the implications washing over him like a wave. Leave his home, the only place he'd found peace after the war? But looking at the hope in the horse's eyes, Frank felt something inside him shift. What was he really leaving behind? A dilapidated cabin he could barely maintain, a lonely existence marked by nightmares and isolation. These horses had given him more purpose in 2 days than he'd found in the last decade. They'd helped him reconnect with his community, given him a reason to get up in the morning, ease the constant pain of his memories. "If we do this," Frank said slowly, "there's no coming back. Reynolds seems like the type to hold a grudge. Taking his horses would be theft." Liberty's gaze never wavered, patient and understanding. Honor and Valor stood at attention, waiting for Frank's decision, with an almost military stillness that felt familiar to the old Marine. The sound of a vehicle approaching in the distance made the decision urgent. Frank glanced at his watch. 10:30 a.m. Reynolds was early. "Back door it is," Frank muttered, making his decision. "Give me 5 minutes." Frank hurried into his cabin, heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration he hadn't felt since combat. He grabbed his rucksack, always packed with emergency supplies, a habit from his military days, and stuffed in the money from his footlocker. He added a few more essentials: his medication, extra socks, a flashlight, his hunting knife. As an afterthought, he grabbed the photograph of his son's family and tucked it into a side pocket. His rifle came last, a decision he made with grim understanding of what running might mean. Frank Miller, decorated Marine, was about to become a fugitive over 3 horses he'd known for less than 3 days. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh. When Frank emerged from the cabin, the horses were waiting at the tree line behind his property. The sound of Reynolds' vehicle was growing closer, a heavy engine, probably a truck pulling a horse trailer. Frank had minutes at most. Without a backward glance at the cabin that had been his sanctuary and prison for the last 20 years, Frank slung his rifle over his shoulder, tightened the straps on his rucksack, and hurried toward the horses and the promise of an uncertain future. Frank's knowledge of the mountains west of his property was limited to what he could see from his cabin and the occasional hunting trip in his better days. But as they moved swiftly through the forest, it became clear that the horses knew exactly where they were going. Liberty led the way, her massive white form weaving confidently between trees, with Honor and Valor flanking Frank as if to ensure he kept pace. Despite his military training, Frank's damaged knee and years of relative inactivity made the trek challenging. Every step on the uneven terrain sent spikes of pain through his leg, and his breathing grew labored as they climbed. Yet the horses seemed to sense his struggle, adjusting their pace when he faltered and stopping for brief rests when his limping became more pronounced. "I'm slowing you down," Frank gasped during one such rest, leaning against a pine tree and massaging his throbbing knee. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea. Liberty approached, lowering her head to meet his eyes with that uncanny intelligence. She seemed to be assessing him, calculating his endurance against the urgency of their flight. After a moment, she turned and nickered softly to Honor, who immediately moved to stand beside Frank, positioning himself as if offering a ride. Frank shook his head. "I haven't ridden bareback since I was a kid and never without a bridle." Honor remained steadfast, nudging Frank's arm with his muzzle. The message was clear. "Trust me." With a grunt of effort, Frank gripped Honor's mane and pulled himself onto the young colt's back. Honor stood perfectly still until Frank was settled, then began moving forward with a smooth gait that minimized jarring to Frank's knee. Liberty took the lead again, with Valor bringing up the rear, all three horses moving with purpose through terrain that grew increasingly rugged. From his elevated position, Frank could occasionally glimpse the valley below. Once he caught sight of a dust cloud on the road to his cabin, Reynolds arriving, no doubt. The man would find an empty cabin, evidence of hasty departure, and 3 missing horses. Frank had no illusions about what would happen next. Reynolds would contact the authorities, report the horses stolen. Frank Miller, respected veteran, would become Frank Miller, horse thief. "No going back now," he murmured, patting Honor's neck. The colt's ears flicked back at his voice, acknowledging his words with a small gesture that somehow conveyed understanding. They traveled until dusk, painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Liberty finally led them to a small clearing beside a stream, sheltered by a rock outcropping that would hide them from aerial view. As Honor knelt carefully to allow Frank to dismount, the old Marine marveled at the colt's consideration. No ordinary horse would think to make dismounting easier for a rider with a bad knee. Frank's military training took over as he established their camp. He filled his canteen from the stream, laid out his bedroll under the rock overhang, and took stock of their situation. His provisions wouldn't last more than a few days, but the horses seemed unconcerned, grazing contentedly on the abundant mountain grass. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped sharply. Frank built a small, well-concealed fire, positioning it under the rock overhang to minimize visible light. He sat close to the flames, warming his hands and considering their next move. The mountains offered temporary refuge, but they couldn't stay here indefinitely, especially as winter approached. To Frank's surprise, the horses gathered around the fire, lying down on the ground beside him in a protective circle. Liberty positioned herself between Frank and the open forest, her head held high and alert. Honor and Valor lay on either side, their white coats gleaming softly in the firelight. "You 3 aren't ordinary horses, are you?" Frank asked, though he'd known the answer since that first day. "What are you?" Liberty turned her gaze toward him, and in the flickering light, Frank could see something in her eyes that transcended animal intelligence, a depth of understanding, a wisdom that felt ancient and somehow familiar. She didn't offer any explanation, of course, but her steady presence was oddly comforting. Frank pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders. I had a dog in Vietnam, scout dog, Kaiser, German Shepherd, smartest animal I'd ever met. Saved my life more times than I could count, could sense ambushes, find hidden tunnels, alert us to danger before we even knew it was there. The horses listened attentively, their ears pricked forward. One night we were on patrol in a village that was supposed to be friendly. Kaiser started acting strange, not his usual alert behavior, something different. He kept trying to lead me away from the village, pulling at my sleeve, whining. I trusted that dog with my life, so I ordered my squad to fall back. Frank paused, stirring the fire with a stick. 10 minutes later, the whole village erupted in gunfire. VC had been waiting for us. Would have been a massacre if we'd stayed. Liberty's eyes never left Frank's face as he continued. After the war, I tried to adopt Kaiser, bring him home with me. Military said no. Service dogs weren't pets. They were equipment. Left him behind. Never forgave myself for that. Frank hadn't spoken of Kaiser in decades, had locked away the memory along with so many others from that time. Yet here, in the wilderness with these three extraordinary creatures, the words flowed freely, unburdening him of a weight he'd carried for far too long. "You remind me of him," Frank told Liberty. "Not just smart. It's like you see things others don't, understand things others can't." Liberty moved closer, resting her head gently in Frank's lap. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender that Frank found himself blinking back tears. He stroked her forelock, the silky white hair slipping through his fingers like water. "Guess we're all fugitives now," he said with a wry smile. "Old man and 3 horses on the run. Reynolds won't give up easily, not with how valuable you must be." Honor and Valor exchanged a glance that seemed significant, though Frank couldn't interpret its meaning. There was communication happening between the horses, complex and subtle, that went beyond anything he'd ever witnessed in animals. As the night deepened, Frank's thoughts turned to practical matters. They needed a destination, somewhere they could go unnoticed. The national forest extended for hundreds of miles, but winter in Montana was brutal. They needed shelter, supplies, a plan beyond simply running. Frank spread out the small map he kept in his rucksack, a basic topographical chart of the region. Liberty immediately focused on the paper, her eyes tracking across it with obvious comprehension. After a moment of study, she placed her muzzle deliberately on a spot deep in the mountains about 30 miles northwest of their current position. "There?" Frank asked, studying the location. According to the map, it was a remote area with no marked trails or structures. "What's out there?" Liberty merely blinked at him, but her certainty was palpable. Whatever waited at that location, she was convinced it offered them sanctuary. "All right," Frank agreed, folding the map. "We'll head that way at first light. I trust you." Those last 3 words hung in the night air, carrying more significance than Frank had intended. Trust wasn't something he gave easily, not after Vietnam, not after decades of solitude. Yet in these horses, these mysterious, intelligent beings who had entered his life so suddenly, Frank had found something worth trusting, worth fighting for, worth leaving everything behind. As he settled into his bedroll, the horses maintained their protective circle around him. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Frank Miller fell asleep without fear of nightmares, guarded by 3 white sentinels against the encroaching darkness. Dawn broke with a crystalline clarity that only mountain air can provide. Frank woke to find Honor standing guard while Liberty and Valor grazed nearby. The young colt's posture was alert, ears swiveling to catch every sound from the forest around them. When he noticed Frank stirring, Honor turned and nickered softly as if saying good morning. "You been on watch all night?" Frank asked, stretching his stiff muscles. His knee had swollen overnight, the joint tight and painful after yesterday's exertion. Honor blinked slowly, then turned his gaze toward the valley below. Frank followed the Colts' line of sight and felt his stomach tighten. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, a plume of dust rose from what must be a vehicle traveling along the logging road that skirted the base of the mountain. Reynolds had wasted no time beginning his search. "We need to move," Frank muttered, quickly rolling up his bedroll and gathering his meager supplies. The horses seemed to understand the urgency. Liberty immediately stopped grazing and came to stand beside Frank, while Valor stomped out the remaining embers of their small fire, covering them with dirt using precise movements of his hoof. Frank checked his map once more, orienting himself toward the location Liberty had indicated the night before. The terrain ahead looked challenging: steep slopes, dense forest, and eventually a high ridge that would expose them to view if they crossed during daylight. "We'll need to be careful up there," Frank told Liberty, pointing to the ridge. "No cover." Liberty studied the map again, then turned her head slightly to the east, suggesting an alternative route. Frank examined the area she seemed to be indicating, a longer path but one that would keep them under the tree line and avoid the exposed ridge. "Smart girl," Frank nodded. "That's the way we'll go." After a quick breakfast of beef jerky and water from the stream, Frank mounted Honor again, and they set off deeper into the mountains. The forest grew denser as they climbed, ancient pines creating a cathedral-like canopy that filtered the morning sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. Under different circumstances, Frank might have appreciated the beauty, but his military senses were on high alert, constantly scanning for signs of pursuit. Around midday, Liberty suddenly stopped, her ears pricked forward intently. The other horses froze in place, and Frank instinctively reached for his rifle. After a tense moment, Liberty relaxed slightly and moved off the game trail they'd been following, heading into a particularly dense thicket. Frank trusted her instincts without question now, guiding Honor to follow. They had barely concealed themselves when the sound of an ATV engine growled in the distance, growing steadily louder. Frank slid off Honor's back and crouched lower in the underbrush, his hand on his rifle. The horses remained perfectly still, their white coats somehow less visible in the dappled forest light than Frank would have expected. The ATV came into view on the trail they'd just abandoned, a Forest Service vehicle with 2 men aboard. Not Reynolds, but likely responding to his report of stolen horses. They paused at the spot where the horses had left the trail, one man dismounting to examine the ground. "Tracks lead off this way," the man called to his companion, pointing in their direction. "Could be deer, but they look bigger." Frank's grip tightened on his rifle. He had no intention of using it. These men were just doing their job, but the thought of being caught, of Liberty and her Colts being taken away, sent a surge of protectiveness through him that overrode his usual respect for authority. Before the men could follow the tracks, Valor suddenly made a sound Frank hadn't heard before, a perfect imitation of an elk bugle coming from the opposite direction. The men's heads snapped toward the sound, momentarily distracted. "Bull elk," one said excitedly. "Big one by the sound of it." As if on cue, Honor added his own contribution. A convincing series of crashes through the underbrush, also from the direction opposite their hiding place. The Forest Service men exchanged glances, clearly torn between following the horse tracks and investigating the elk sounds. "Hunting season starts next week," the driver said. "Might be worth knowing where that bull is bedding down." His companion nodded, abandoning the horse tracks to return to the ATV. "Let's check it out. Those horse tracks are probably just someone's stock that wandered off anyway." Frank held his breath as the men drove away, following the false elk sounds. Only when the ATV engine had faded completely did he release a shaky sigh of relief. "That was too close," he murmured, patting Valor's neck with newfound appreciation. "How did you learn to do that?" Valor merely blinked, but there was something like pride in his bearing. Liberty nudged them forward, clearly eager to put more distance between themselves and their pursuers. They traveled through the afternoon, taking a circuitous route that avoided open spaces and kept them under cover as much as possible. Frank's admiration for the horse's intelligence grew with each passing hour. They seemed to possess an uncanny awareness of their surroundings, anticipating obstacles before they appeared and finding hidden game trails that made their progress swifter and quieter than should have been possible in such rugged terrain. As dusk approached, Frank noticed a change in Liberty's demeanor. The mare moved with increased purpose, her steps quickening despite the long day's journey. Honor and valor seemed to share her excitement, their ears forward and alert. They were nearing something important. The forest began to thin, transitioning to a landscape of scattered pines and granite outcroppings. Liberty led them around a massive boulder, and suddenly Frank saw it. A small cabin nestled against the mountainside, almost invisible until you were right upon it. The structure was weathered but solid, its logs silvered with age, and its roof covered with a layer of pine needles that helped it blend into the surroundings. "Is this what you were leading me to?" Frank asked, sliding carefully from Honor's back. His knee nearly buckled as it took his weight, the day's ride having done little to ease the inflammation. Liberty approached the cabin, sniffing at the door with familiarity. She turned to look at Frank expectantly, as if waiting for him to open it. With cautious steps, Frank made his way to the cabin. There was no lock on the door, just a simple wooden latch. The hinges creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a single-room interior that hadn't been occupied in years but remained remarkably intact. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and chairs sat in the center, and a narrow cot stood in the corner. Shelves lined the walls, still stocked with dusty cans and supplies. "A hunting cabin," Frank murmured, taking in the scene. "Abandoned, but—" He trailed off, noticing something odd. On the table lay a leather-bound journal, and beside it, a small brass key that gleamed as if recently polished. Frank approached slowly, a strange sensation of déjà vu washing over him. He picked up the journal with trembling hands and opened the cover. The faded handwriting on the first page made his breath catch in his throat. He recognized it immediately, the distinctive script of his old squad leader, Captain James Sullivan, a man who had saved Frank's life in Vietnam, who had been like a father to him during those hellish years, and who had disappeared in the mountains of Montana over 15 years ago. "Sullivan," Frank whispered, looking back at the horses who watched him from the doorway. "How did you know about this place? How could you possibly know?" Frank's hands trembled as he turned the pages of Sullivan's journal. The cabin around him seemed to fade away as he was transported back in time through the careful handwriting of a man he had mourned for 15 years. Liberty moved into the cabin, positioning herself near Frank as if sensing his emotional turmoil. The Colts remained by the door, standing guard. "I can't believe this," Frank murmured, eyes scanning entry after entry. The journal chronicled Sullivan's life after Vietnam, his struggles with PTSD, his withdrawal from society, and eventually his discovery of this remote cabin in the Montana wilderness. But it was the entries from the last year of the journal that made Frank's heart race. April 15, 2010, Frank read aloud. "Discovered something extraordinary today. While tracking what I thought was a wounded elk, I came across a secluded valley about 3 miles north of my cabin. What I found there defies explanation." Frank paused, looking up at Liberty, whose dark eyes remained fixed on him with that uncanny intelligence. He continued reading. "The valley appears untouched by human activity. No logging, no trails, nothing. At its center stands a single massive oak tree that shouldn't exist at this elevation. Beneath it, I found them, 3 white horses unlike any breed I've ever seen. They approached without fear, studying me with an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. When I extended my hand, the largest one, a mare with eyes like midnight, pressed her forehead against my palm. In that moment, something happened. A connection formed. I felt a presence in my mind, gentle but distinct. Not words exactly, but concepts, emotions, images. They were communicating with me. Frank's breath caught in his throat. He looked at Liberty again, suddenly understanding why she had seemed familiar from the first moment he'd found her trapped in the barbed wire. The connection he'd felt wasn't just the bond between human and animal, it was something Sullivan had experienced too. May 3, 2010, Frank continued reading. I visited the horses daily. The mare, I call her Liberty for reasons I can't quite explain, seems to understand my every word. The younger ones, still colts, follow her lead. Today they showed me something remarkable. Liberty placed her forehead against mine, and suddenly I was seeing memories, not mine but hers. Images of distant places, of journeys across continents, of others like her throughout history. Always three, a mare and two colts, always finding humans who need them, humans broken by war, by loss, by trauma. They're not ordinary horses. There's something else entirely. Frank's hand went to his chest, feeling the dog tags he still wore after all these years. The pieces were falling into place, why the horses had stayed with him after he freed Liberty, why they displayed such extraordinary intelligence, why they had led him here. July 18, 2010, the journal continued. Reynolds found me today, claimed the valley is on land he's purchasing, part of his big development plan. Tried to buy me out of this cabin too. When I refused, he made veiled threats about what happens to obstacles in his path. The horses sensed my distress. My Liberty showed me another valley further west where they could relocate, but I worry Reynolds won't stop. He's seen them now, knows they're special. His greed is palpable. He called them genetic anomalies worth millions. I won't let him capture them, study them, breed them like common animals. There's so much more. Frank's jaw tightened at the mention of Reynolds. The man had been hunting these horses for years, not months. Sullivan's disappearance 15 years ago suddenly seemed far less accidental than the official reports had claimed. The final entry was dated August 2, 2010. Something's wrong. Reynolds's men have been spotted near the valley. I've warned the horses, but Liberty insists on staying close to me. I think they're planning something. If you're reading this, if you found my cabin and this journal, you've been chosen. The horses led you here for a reason. They chose me because of my pain, my isolation after Vietnam. They healed me in ways I never thought possible. Now they've chosen you. The brass key opens a lockbox under the floorboard beneath the cot. Inside is everything you need to know, everything I've learned about them, and evidence against Reynolds that I've gathered. Trust the horses. They know more than we can imagine. And whatever you do, keep them safe. They're the last of their kind. The journal ended there. Frank closed it slowly, the implications settling over him like a heavy blanket. Sullivan had disappeared shortly after writing that final entry. The official story was that he had gotten lost in the mountains during an early snowstorm. His body had never been found. Reynolds, Frank whispered, the name bitter on his tongue. He did something to Sullivan. Liberty lowered her head, gently nudging the journal, then looking meaningfully at the cot mentioned in the final entry. Frank rose stiffly, his knee protesting as he crossed the small cabin. He pushed the cot aside, revealing worn floorboards beneath. One board was slightly shorter than the others, with a small gap at one end. Frank pried it up with his knife, revealing a metal lockbox nestled in the space below. The brass key from the table fit perfectly. Inside the lockbox, Frank found a sealed envelope, a USB drive, and a small leather pouch. He opened the envelope first, unfolding several pages of Sullivan's handwriting, more detailed than the journal entries, describing his discoveries about the horses. Frank's eyes widened as he read. "You're not just intelligent," he said, looking up at Liberty. "You're guardians, healers. You find people who are broken and help them find purpose again." Liberty inclined her head in what seemed like confirmation. Frank continued reading, learning how the horses had appeared throughout history, always in times of conflict, always finding soldiers damaged by war. They possessed abilities beyond normal animals. Their intelligence, their empathic connection, their perfect recall of places and routes, their ability to mimic sounds. But most remarkably, Sullivan had documented their healing presence, how veterans who spent time with them experienced fewer nightmares, reduced anxiety, improved physical healing. The perfect therapy animals, Frank murmured, but natural, not trained. He reached for the leather pouch, opening it to find a small recorder and several memory cards labeled with dates. Playing the first recording, Frank heard Sullivan's voice, older but unmistakable, describing a conversation he'd overheard between Reynolds and someone named Carter. "Worth millions to the military," Reynolds was saying. "Imagine soldiers with that kind of intelligence, that healing ability. The genetic material alone could revolutionize bioweapon development." "But they're just horses," Carter replied, sounding skeptical. "No," Reynolds insisted. "They're evolutionary anomalies, perfect specimens. I've tracked their bloodline through history, always the same pattern. A mare and 2 colts, always pure white, always with extraordinary abilities. The military will pay whatever I ask once they see the test results." The recording ended abruptly. Frank felt sick. Reynolds didn't want the horses for breeding or show. He wanted to exploit them, experiment on them, sell their genetic material to the highest bidder. And Sullivan had stood in his way. Valor suddenly whinnied from the doorway, the sound soft but urgent. Honor joined him, both colts alert and listening. A moment later, Frank heard it too, the distant sound of helicopter rotors. The helicopter's rhythmic thumping grew louder, echoing across the mountain slopes. Frank's military instincts kicked in immediately. He quickly gathered Sullivan's evidence, stuffing the journal, USB drive, and recordings into his rucksack. Years of combat experience had taught him how to move under pressure, his movements efficient despite his damaged knee. "We can't stay here," he told the horses, who were already shifting anxiously. "They'll spot the cabin." Liberty nudged him toward the back wall where a small window overlooked a steep, densely forested slope. Frank understood immediately. It was their escape route, away from the approaching helicopter. He forced the window open, its frame swollen with years of mountain moisture, and peered out. The drop was about 5 feet to sloping ground that quickly disappeared into thick pine forest. "You first," Frank told the horses, realizing as he said it how absurd it would sound to anyone else instructing horses to exit through a window, but these were no ordinary horses. Honor approached the window, somehow managing to compress his large frame to slip through the opening with an agility that defied his size. Valor followed, executing the same maneuver with equal grace. Liberty waited, watching Frank with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand everything. "I'm right behind you," Frank assured her, gathering the last of Sullivan's evidence. The helicopter sound was directly overhead now. Frank heard voices outside the cabin, men on the ground moving quickly toward the entrance. Reynolds had found them, likely tracking them with the helicopter's infrared cameras that could easily spot 3 white horses in the wilderness. Liberty squeezed through the window just as the cabin door burst open. Frank didn't hesitate. He dove through the opening, landing awkwardly on his bad knee, but allowing momentum to carry him into a roll down the slope. Pain shot through his leg, but adrenaline pushed it aside as he scrambled into the cover of the trees. The horses were waiting for him, Honor already positioned to allow Frank to mount. Frank swung onto the colt's back, clutching his rifle in one hand and the saddle horn in the other. Behind them, angry shouts erupted from the cabin as Reynolds's men discovered their quarry had escaped. "Go," Frank urged, and Honor needed no further encouragement. The 3 horses moved as one, descending the steep slope with a sure-footedness that no ordinary horse could manage on such treacherous terrain. The dense forest provided cover, the thick canopy hiding them from the helicopter that now circled overhead. Liberty led them on a winding path that seemed random at first but soon revealed its strategy. They were using the terrain to their advantage, staying under dense cover, crossing rocky ground that would leave minimal tracks, and moving downhill where the forest grew thicker. Frank heard the men crashing through the woods behind them, but the sounds grew fainter as the horses' superior knowledge of the landscape allowed them to outpace their pursuers. After what felt like hours of intense flight, Liberty finally slowed their pace, leading them into a narrow ravine where a small stream trickled between moss-covered rocks. The ravine walls rose steeply on either side, creating a natural fortress that would be difficult to spot from above. The horses picked their way carefully along the stream bed, leaving no tracks on the stone surface. The sound of the helicopter had faded completely when Liberty finally led them into a small clearing hidden within the ravine. A fallen tree created a natural shelter, and the stream widened into a shallow pool. It was an ideal temporary hiding place. Frank slid from Honor's back, his knee buckling as it took his weight. He leaned against a boulder, breathing heavily from the exertion and adrenaline of their escape. The horses gathered around him, their own breathing elevated but quickly returning to normal. "That was too close," Frank said, rubbing his throbbing knee. "Reynolds is throwing everything he has at finding you." Frank pulled out Sullivan's journal again, flipping through the pages with renewed purpose. Now that he understood what the horses were and what Reynolds wanted to do with them, the stakes had become infinitely higher. This wasn't just about 3 remarkable animals. It was about protecting something truly extraordinary from exploitation and cruelty. "Sullivan knew," Frank murmured, finding a passage he'd noticed earlier. He knew Reynolds was dangerous, and he was gathering evidence against him. Liberty moved closer, her eyes on the journal. Frank looked up at her, a new understanding dawning. "That's why you brought me to his cabin, isn't it? You needed someone who could use this evidence, someone who would understand what Sullivan was trying to do." Liberty's gentle nickering seemed to confirm his theory. Frank reached for the USB drive, turning it over in his palm. It contained evidence, recordings, documents, perhaps photographs, that Sullivan had collected against Reynolds. Evidence that had likely cost Sullivan his life. "We can't just run forever," Frank said, thinking aloud. "Reynolds has resources, connections. He'll keep hunting you no matter where we go." He looked at the 3 horses, their white coats still remarkably clean despite their flight through the forest. "We need to stop him." Honor and Valor exchanged one of their meaningful glances, then looked at Frank with what seemed like approval. They had chosen him for a reason, not just because he had freed Liberty from the barbed wire, but because they somehow knew he had the courage and determination to finish what Sullivan had started. Frank checked his watch. Nearly 5 p.m. Too late to make it to town before everything closed, but they could reach civilization by morning if they traveled through the night. The USB drive and recordings were useless in the wilderness. He needed to get them to someone with the authority to act on Sullivan's evidence. "We'll rest for an hour," Frank decided, then head toward Clearwater. The small town was about 15 miles away. A sheriff's office, a newspaper, people who knew Frank as a respected veteran rather than a horse thief. If he could get Sullivan's evidence to the right hands before Reynolds caught up with them, they might have a chance. As the horses grazed on the sparse vegetation along the stream bank, Frank examined the recordings more closely. Sullivan had documented multiple conversations that implicated Reynolds in questionable business practices, environmental violations, and even veiled threats. But the most damning evidence was Reynolds' own voice discussing his plans for the horses. The genetic material alone could revolutionize bioweapon development, Reynolds had said. Those words, captured on Sullivan's recorder, made Frank's blood run cold. Reynolds wasn't just a wealthy man obsessed with owning rare horses. He was willing to subject these extraordinary creatures to painful experimentation for military applications. As Frank replaced the recorder in his pack, he noticed Liberty watching him intently. He reached out to stroke her neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath her smooth coat. "I won't let him take you," Frank promised. "Any of you." Liberty pressed her forehead against Frank's chest, and in that moment, something extraordinary happened. Frank felt a warmth spreading through him, starting at the point of contact and flowing outward, enveloping his entire body. The chronic pain in his knee, a constant companion for decades, suddenly receded, becoming a distant throb rather than the sharp agony he'd grown accustomed to. His mind cleared, the fog of anxiety that had clouded his thoughts since Vietnam, lifting like morning mist in sunshine. When Liberty pulled away, Frank stood straighter than he had in years. He flexed his knee experimentally, finding it still damaged, but significantly improved, as if years of inflammation had been reduced in moments. "Is this what Sullivan meant?" Frank asked in wonder. "The healing presence?" Honor approached now, gently butting his head against Frank's shoulder in what seemed like affection. Valor completed the circle, the three white horses surrounding Frank in a moment of connection that transcended words. Frank felt tears welling in his eyes, not from pain or sorrow, but from a profound sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for so long. These extraordinary beings had chosen him, trusted him with their safety, and now offered him healing in return. In that moment, Frank knew with absolute certainty that he would do whatever it took to protect them, not just from Reynolds, but from anyone who would exploit their gifts for selfish or destructive purposes. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the ravine. It was time to move. Frank mounted Honor with newfound ease, his strengthened knee allowing him to swing up without the grimace of pain that had accompanied every movement for decades. "Let's end this," Frank said with quiet determination, "for Sullivan, for all of us." Liberty led the way out of the ravine, her white form ghost-like in the gathering dusk. As they emerged from their hiding place, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky overhead, guiding them toward clear water, and toward a confrontation that would determine not just their future, but perhaps the future of something ancient and precious that had walked alongside humanity's wounded warriors throughout history. Dawn was breaking over Clearwater as Frank and the horses emerged from the forest at the town's edge. They had traveled through the night, navigating treacherous mountain terrain with the sure-footed precision that only Liberty and her Colts could manage. Frank's strengthened knee had held up remarkably well, the horse's healing presence continuing to work its subtle magic as they journeyed. The small Montana town was just waking up, lights appearing in windows, the local diner's sign flickering on, a few early risers walking dogs or collecting newspapers. Frank knew they couldn't simply ride into town unnoticed. 3 pure white horses and a man who had been reported for theft would attract immediate attention. "We need somewhere to lay low while I figure this out," Frank told Liberty, who was scanning the town with those intelligent eyes. The mare turned her head toward a modestly sized building set back from the main street, the town's small newspaper office, the Clearwater Gazette. A light was already on inside despite the early hour. "The press," Frank nodded, understanding Liberty's suggestion immediately. "Smart choice. If Reynolds has the sheriff in his pocket, we need to make the evidence public." Frank dismounted and approached Honor, stroking the colt's neck gratefully. "You 3 need to stay hidden. I'll handle this part alone." Liberty nickered softly, her gaze never leaving Frank's face. There was concern in those eyes, a worry that went beyond animal instinct. "I'll be careful," Frank promised. "But if something happens to me, you need to run. Get as far from Reynolds as you can." The 3 horses stood motionless, their white coats gleaming in the early morning light. Frank had the distinct impression they were unwilling to accept his instruction to flee, that they would not abandon him regardless of the danger. "Stubborn," Frank muttered with affection, then turned toward town. "Stay in the tree line. I'll be back as soon as I can." Frank pulled his cap low over his eyes and made his way toward the newspaper office, Sullivan's evidence secure in his rucksack. The door was locked, but a side window showed a single person working inside, a woman in her 50s hunched over a computer, coffee mug at her elbow. Frank knocked gently on the window. The woman looked up, startled, then approached cautiously. When she saw Frank, recognition dawned on her face, and she quickly moved to unlock the front door. "Frank Miller?" she asked as she opened the door. "What on earth are you doing here at this hour?" "Morning, Sarah." Frank nodded, recognizing the newspaper's editor, whom he'd known distantly for years. "I need your help. It's about James Sullivan." Sarah's eyebrows shot up. "Sullivan? He's been gone for 15 years. "I know what happened to him," Frank said, his voice low and urgent. "And the man responsible is after me now." Sarah ushered him inside, locking the door behind them. As Frank laid out Sullivan's evidence on her desk, the journal, the recordings, the USB drive, her journalistic instincts clearly overrode any skepticism. When she played the first recording of Reynolds discussing using the horses for bioweapon development, her face hardened with determination. "This is serious, Frank. Criminal," she said, examining the USB drive's contents on her computer. "But why is Reynolds so obsessed with these horses?" "They're special," Frank replied carefully. "Extraordinary intelligence, healing abilities. Sullivan documented it all." Sarah was already drafting an article, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "I can get this online immediately and send copies to the state police, FBI, and governor's office. Reynolds has friends in the local sheriff's department, but this is too big for him to contain if we spread it wide enough." Frank felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Finally, someone believed him, someone who could help expose Reynolds and protect the horses. A sudden commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, Frank saw several trucks pulling up in front of the newspaper office. Reynolds' men, moving with purpose, and at their center, Daniel Reynolds himself. "They followed me," Frank realized with horror, or they were already watching the town. Sarah grabbed her phone. "I'm calling backup, but it'll take time. The state police station is 30 minutes away." Frank peered out the window again. Reynolds and 6 men were approaching the building, and 2 of them carried rifles. Time was running out. "Keep working," Frank instructed Sarah. "Get that evidence online, send it everywhere you can. I need to go back to the horses." "Frank, wait," Sarah called, but he was already slipping out the back door of the office. Frank moved through the alleyways of Clearwater, keeping to shadows as he made his way back toward where he'd left the horses. His military training served him well, allowing him to avoid Reynolds' men who were now spreading through the small town in search of him. When he reached the tree line, however, the horses were gone. Frank's heart sank. Had Reynolds found them already? Had they fled as he'd instructed? He scanned the area desperately, looking for any sign of their direction. A soft nickering drew his attention. Not from the forest, but from town. Specifically from the direction of the Clearwater Community Center, where town meetings and events were held. Frank moved cautiously toward the sound, keeping out of sight. What he saw as he approached the community center stopped him in his tracks. Honor and Valor stood proudly on the building's wide front steps, their white coats gleaming in the morning sun. Around them had gathered a crowd of townspeople, drawn by the unusual sight of 2 magnificent white Colts appearing in the center of town. But it was what the Colts were doing that truly astonished Frank and everyone watching. Honor stood perfectly still while Valor delicately held Sullivan's old service dog tags in his mouth, tags that Frank had last seen in the cabin, that he hadn't even realized were missing from his pack. As the crowd watched in amazement, Valor placed the tags deliberately on the ground, then used his hoof to arrange them neatly beside a photograph of Captain James Sullivan. The Colts had somehow retrieved the photograph from the town's Veterans Memorial inside the community center, a tribute to local soldiers that included Sullivan after his disappearance. They had placed it beside Sullivan's dog tags in a display that could not be misinterpreted, a deliberate connection between Sullivan and themselves. And as if this wasn't extraordinary enough, the Colts then did something that sent gasps rippling through the growing crowd. They began to change, not in a magical, instantaneous transformation, but in a subtle shifting of features that became increasingly apparent to everyone watching. Honor's eyes, dark and intelligent, now unmistakably resembled Sullivan's own eyes as they appeared in the photograph. Valor's stance and the tilt of his head mirrored Sullivan's military posture exactly. "My God," someone in the crowd whispered, "they're his, they belong to Sullivan." The murmurs spread rapidly. Many in Clearwater had known and respected James Sullivan. His disappearance had affected the entire community, and Reynolds's subsequent purchase of land in the area had always been viewed with suspicion by locals who had considered Sullivan a friend. As Frank watched from the shadows, he understood what the Colts were doing. They were creating public witnesses, ensuring that Reynolds couldn't simply make them disappear. They were connecting themselves to Sullivan in the minds of the townspeople, making their story public in a way that couldn't be covered up. It was then that Frank noticed Liberty. The mare stood at the edge of the crowd, her eyes fixed not on her Colts, but on the road leading into town, where Reynolds's trucks were now converging on the community center, drawn by the commotion. Reynolds himself stepped out of the lead vehicle, his face contorted with rage as he saw the Colts on display and the gathering crowd. He strode forward, two armed men flanking him. "Those horses are my property," he announced loudly, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "They've been stolen from my ranch, and I'm here to recover them." An elderly man stepped forward from the crowd, the town's former mayor, Frank recognized. "These horses were James Sullivan's," he said firmly. "Everyone here can see it, the resemblance to him in their bearing, even their eyes. Sullivan's dog's tags with them. This means something." Reynolds scoffed. "This is absurd. They're valuable Lipizaners, nothing more, and they belong to me." "Is that why you want them for bioweapon development?" The voice came from behind Reynolds. Sarah stood there, holding printouts of Sullivan's evidence. "Or why James Sullivan disappeared after documenting your threats against him." The crowd's mood shifted instantly, people drawing together, forming a protective circle around the Colts. Reynolds' men looked increasingly uncomfortable as more townspeople arrived, drawn by calls and texts spreading the news. Reynolds' face paled as he saw his control of the situation slipping away. "This is ridiculous," he blustered. "You have no proof." "We have Sullivan's journal," Frank said, finally stepping forward. "His recordings of your conversations, evidence he gathered before he disappeared, evidence that suggests you were involved in what happened to him." Reynolds' hand moved toward his jacket, but before he could reach whatever he was carrying, Liberty appeared. The massive white mare walked calmly through the crowd, which parted for her in awe. She positioned herself between Reynolds and the Colts, her eyes fixed on him with unmistakable recognition. The tension in the air was palpable as horse and man faced each other. Liberty calm and majestic, Reynolds increasingly desperate. The crowd had grown to include most of Clearwater's residents, all witnesses to this extraordinary standoff. "It's over, Reynolds," Frank said quietly. "The evidence is already online, sent to state authorities. They're on their way." The sound of distant sirens confirmed Frank's words. Reynolds's men began backing toward their vehicles, unwilling to add more charges to whatever was coming. Reynolds himself stood frozen, his ambitions crumbling before his eyes. In that moment, honor and valor moved in perfect unison down the steps to stand beside Liberty. The three white horses formed a line, their intelligent eyes fixed on Reynolds with what could only be described as judgment. The symbolism was lost on no one present. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. As state police vehicles appeared at the edge of town, Reynolds made one last, desperate lunge toward the horses. Frank stepped forward to intercept him, but it was unnecessary. Liberty reared up, her massive form blocking Reynolds' path, forcing him back until he stumbled and fell before the entire town. When the authorities took Reynolds away, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Sullivan's meticulous documentation, combined with testimony from the townspeople who had witnessed Reynolds' behavior, ensured that justice would finally be served, not just for the horses, but for James Sullivan as well. In the days that followed, as Reynolds faced multiple charges and his operations were investigated, Frank found himself unexpectedly embraced by the Clearwater community. The story of how he had saved Liberty from barbed wire, how the horses had chosen him as their protector, spread throughout the region. But it was the horses themselves who became the heart of Clearwater's revival. With Sullivan's cabin serving as their home base, Liberty, honor, and valor began what would become their true purpose, helping veterans heal. Word spread about the extraordinary white horses with healing abilities, and slowly, carefully, wounded warriors began making pilgrimages to the small Montana town. Frank, once isolated and lost in his own trauma, found himself at the center of something meaningful, a sanctuary for those who, like him, carried the invisible wounds of war. The horses worked their subtle magic, easing pain, calming nightmares, restoring hope to those who had lost it. And on quiet evenings, when Frank sat on the porch of Sullivan's cabin, watching the three white horses grazing peacefully in the valley below, he sometimes felt a presence beside him, the spirit of his old squad leader, watching over them all, finally at peace.